Brian Harlan's hand shot out and slapped the boarding pass right out of Sophia's fingers. It fluttered to the floor like a broken wing. "Get out of my face," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that meant he had done this before and had never once been stopped. A young girl stood frozen in the aisle of a first-class cabin, her hands still raised from where the paper had just been knocked away. Her eyes wide, but dry. The whole cabin saw it. Nobody moved, and that flight never left the ground. If this story makes your blood boil, you are not alone. Subscribe to our channel right now. Hit that notification bell and stay with us until the very end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let us go back to where it all began. The day began the way most days do for a young girl who has spent her whole life being underestimated. Sophia Carter woke up before her alarm. She always did. Not because she was anxious, not because she was nervous, but because her mind never really slept all the way. It was always turning, calculating, running through problems the way other kids ran through hallways, while most children her age were dreaming about cartoons or birthday parties. Sophia's brain was already sorting through equations, patterns, and possibilities. That day, though, was different. That day, she let herself feel excited. She sat at the edge of her bed in the quiet of her Dallas bedroom and looked at the small printed boarding pass on her nightstand. She had placed it there the night before, right next to her water glass, so it would be the first thing she saw when she opened her eyes. She reached for it now, turned it over in her hands, and read the words she had already memorized. Flight to Phoenix. Window seat in first class. Her father's voice came back to her from some time ago, warm and proud, the way it only got on the rare occasions when he paused long enough from building his empire to truly see his daughter. "You won the national math competition, baby girl. You beat kids twice your age from schools that had far more funding than we had. You know what that means? That math is universal?" She had answered. David Carter had laughed, a real laugh, deep and full, and pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than usual. "It means you fly first class to Phoenix. You sit in that front seat, and you look out that window, and you remember that the world is bigger than anyone tries to tell you it is." Sophia had smiled into his shoulder. She had not told him that she already knew that. She had known it for years, but she loved him for saying it anyway. Now, standing in her room, she folded the boarding pass carefully, tucked it into the front pocket of her small backpack, and went to find her nanny, Helen Brooks, who was already downstairs in the kitchen, dressed and ready, sipping coffee like a woman who had been awake for hours. Helen was a woman in her 60s. She had the kind of face that had been through things, real things, and had come out the other side not bitter, but steady. She had been with the Carter family for some time. She had watched Sophia grow from a quiet young child who lined up her building blocks by height into the composed, sharp young girl standing in front of her now. "You ready?" Helen asked, setting down her mug. "I've been ready," Sophia said. Helen smiled. "Of course you have." The drive to Dallas Love Field was easy. Light traffic, early sun, the city still slow and unhurried. Sophia sat in the back seat with her backpack in her lap and her face turned toward the window, watching the highway move past. She was not a child who needed to fill silence with noise. She could sit with her own thoughts for hours and never feel lonely in them. But this day, one thought kept rising above the rest. First class. Window seat. She pressed her fingers against the outside pocket of her backpack just to feel the small, stiff rectangle of the boarding pass through the fabric. It was still there, Of course it was still there, but she pressed her fingers against it again anyway. The airport was already buzzing by the time they arrived. Families with strollers, businessmen with rolling suitcases, couples arguing over which terminal they needed. Helen moved through it with the practiced calm of someone who had navigated crowded places her whole life. And Sophia stayed close beside her, her small sneakers squeaking lightly on the polished floor. They cleared security without issue. They found the gate without difficulty, and they arrived with plenty of time to spare, which Sophia used to sit near the large windows and watch the planes roll slowly across the tarmac, while Helen reviewed her phone and sipped a bottle of water. It was not until the boarding announcement that anything shifted. The gate agent called first class, and Sophia stood up immediately, swinging her backpack over one shoulder. Helen followed behind her, tucking her phone away, and together they joined the small line forming at the jetway door. Sophia handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, a young woman with a neat braid and a smile that looked genuine rather than practiced. "Have a wonderful flight," the agent said. "Thank you," Sophia answered, and she meant it. They walked down the jetway, the walls close and humming, the air already carrying that particular airplane smell of recycled cool and distant fuel. Sophia felt her pulse lift slightly, not fear, just anticipation, as the jetway opened into the aircraft door and she stepped aboard. The flight attendant near the entrance gave her a warm nod. Sophia returned it. She turned left toward first class, counting the rows in her head without meaning to, and then she looked up toward her row and stopped. Her smile faded. There was a man in her seat. He was somewhere in his mid to late 50s, broad-shouldered, with gray at his temples, and the thick, settled look of a man who was used to taking up space and not being questioned about it. He had his jacket folded across his lap, and his shoes planted firmly on the floor, and he was staring straight ahead with the blank, self-satisfied expression of someone who had already decided that wherever he was sitting was exactly where he should be. Sophia walked up the aisle slowly, checking the number above the overhead bin as she passed. Her row. She stopped beside the seat. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was polite, clear, the way Helen had always taught her to speak to strangers, direct but not aggressive, firm but not rude. "I think you might be in my seat. This is my window seat." The man turned his head. He looked at her, really looked at her, took in her age, her size, her backpack, her brown skin, and something shifted in his expression. It was not confusion. It was not embarrassment. It was something else, something colder. "This is my seat," he said, flatly. Sophia did not flinch. She unzipped the front pocket of her backpack and pulled out the boarding pass. She held it out toward him. "My boarding pass says this is my seat, window seat." He didn't take the pass. He barely glanced at it. "Listen, kid," he said, and his voice dropped into a register that was not quite threatening, but was definitely dismissive. "First class isn't a playground. Go find your real seat." The words landed like something physical. Behind her, Helen had stopped in the aisle. She heard it. The passengers in the surrounding seats heard it. A woman across the aisle looked up sharply. A man 2 rows back went still. Sophia stood her ground. "This is my real seat," she said quietly. "My boarding pass has my name on it. Sophia Carter, my seat." The man, Brian Harlan, though she didn't know his name yet, shifted in the seat and actually had the audacity to lean back further, like he was making himself more comfortable, like the conversation was over because he had decided it was. "There must be a mix-up," he said, looking away from her. "Talk to the flight attendant." So Sophia did. She turned and walked a few steps back toward the flight attendant station at the front of the cabin. The attendant was a woman named Melissa. Her name tag was visible, and she had the kind of measured, professional warmth that came from years of managing difficult situations without letting them become scenes, except this was already becoming a scene. "There's a man in my seat," Sophia told Melissa, holding out her boarding pass. "I showed him my boarding pass and he won't move." Melissa took the pass, looked at it, then looked at the seat, then pulled up the manifest on the small screen near the galley. It took only a moment. "You're absolutely right," Melissa said. Her voice was calm, but her jaw had tightened slightly. "That seat is assigned to you. Let me handle this." She walked up the aisle with the kind of purposeful stride that flight attendants develop over years of moving through narrow spaces. She stopped beside the seat. Sophia followed and stood slightly behind her. "Sir," Melissa said pleasantly, "I need to see your boarding pass, please." Brian Harlan looked at her. Then he looked at Sophia. Then he looked back at Melissa with an expression that said he was already annoyed by the question. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced his boarding pass with the deliberate slowness of a man who was performing patience rather than feeling it. Melissa looked at it. The pause that followed was just long enough to be noticeable. "Sir," she said, still pleasant, still professional, "your assigned seat is in the main cabin. You'll need to move so this passenger can take her seat." Brian blinked just once. Then the blinking stopped, and something else took over. "There's been an error," he said. "I purchased first class. I understand your concern, but according to our manifest, the seat you purchased is in the main cabin. That's impossible." His voice had gone up slightly, not a lot, just enough to signal that the temperature was rising. "I have traveled on this airline for many years. I am a Platinum Elite member. I did not pay for a middle seat in economy." "I understand," Melissa said. "And if there's been an error, we'll absolutely address it. But right now, I need you to move so this passenger can have her assigned seat." Brian looked at Sophia again. That look. It was the kind of look that said he had already categorized her, filed her away, decided what she was and what she deserved and what this moment meant. It was the kind of look that people who have never had to question their own assumptions give to people who challenge those assumptions simply by existing. "This is ridiculous," he said, loud enough now that passengers in the nearest rows were no longer pretending not to listen. "You're going to inconvenience me, a Platinum Elite member with many years on this airline, because of a seat mix-up involving a child? Sir, where is her parent? Why is a young girl sitting alone in first class? Doesn't that seem odd to you?" Helen stepped forward then. She had been waiting. She was not a woman who inserted herself quickly into situations. She believed in giving people enough rope, enough time, enough space to either fix themselves or hang themselves with what they were showing. Brian Harlan had been showing quite a lot. "I am her guardian," Helen said, her voice carrying the particular authority of a woman who has spent decades not being talked over. "I am sitting right beside her. Our tickets are both in first class, both purchased and confirmed, and this child has done nothing wrong except stand in the aisle and ask for what belongs to her." Brian turned on Helen with a look that was something between contempt and condescension. "And you are?" "Irrelevant to this conversation," Helen said crisply. "What is relevant is that this seat belongs to her. Your boarding pass says the main cabin, and you have now delayed boarding for every passenger on this aircraft. Because you don't want to be wrong." There was a sound from behind them. Not a laugh, not quite, but something adjacent to it. A sharp exhale. A muffled sound of acknowledgement from the passengers close enough to hear. Because Helen had said, plainly and without decoration, exactly what everyone was thinking. Brian's face changed. Not softened, changed. The color shifted. The jaw set harder. His eyes went briefly to the passengers watching him, to the phones that were already raised in hands nearby, and something ugly moved through his expression before he controlled it. "I'm not sitting in economy," he said, and now the pleasantness was entirely gone. His voice was flat and hard. "I paid for first class. I don't know how this little girl ended up with a first-class ticket." He stopped, just long enough for everyone around him to hear what he had not quite said, but had absolutely meant. Sophia heard it. She felt it. Not in her chest the way children sometimes feel things, hot and immediate and difficult to contain, but somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper, in the place where she kept the things she had learned too young about how the world looked at her. She looked at Brian Harlan, and she made a decision. She was not going to cry. She was not going to shout. She was not going to say anything she couldn't say calmly, clearly, and with her full name behind it. She took a step forward so that she was standing beside Melissa rather than behind her, and she looked Brian Harlan directly in the eye. "My name is Sophia Carter," she said. "My boarding pass has my name on it, my seat number on it. I checked in at the counter, I went through security, I walked down the jetway, and I found a stranger sitting in my seat. I showed you my boarding pass. You told me first class isn't for kids like me." She paused, just for one breath. "I'm asking you one more time, respectfully, to please move to your assigned seat." The cabin was completely silent. That particular silence that is not empty but full. Full of awareness, of held breath, of people all arriving at the same understanding at the same moment. Melissa was looking at Sophia with something in her expression that she was trying very hard to keep professional, and was only partially succeeding at. Brian Harlan stared at the young girl in front of him, and then, because he was the kind of man he was, he said the worst possible thing. "No, just that. Just that one syllable, flat and final and dripping with everything it didn't need to say out loud. No, I'm not moving. If this airline wants to remove me from this seat, they can do it themselves. But I am not moving for a child." Melissa took a short breath. Sophia saw her take it, saw the flicker of something cross her face. Not surprise, because Melissa had been doing this job long enough that very little surprised her. But something else, a kind of recognition, maybe, of what this moment had just become. "Sir," Melissa said, "if you refuse to comply, I'll need to contact the captain." "Then contact the captain." So she did, and the story changed. There were other flight attendants on that aircraft, and within moments of Melissa's call, the senior one, a man named Mr. Ellis, who had the silver hair and measured stride of someone who had been navigating mid-air crises for decades, appeared at the front of the cabin and walked toward the row with an expression that was entirely, professionally blank. He looked at Brian. He looked at Sophia. He looked at Melissa, who handed him both boarding passes without a word. Mr. Ellis read them once. He didn't need to read them twice. "Sir," he said, "I need you to come with me, please." "I'm not going anywhere," Brian said. "I want to speak with the captain." "You'll have that opportunity. Please, come with me." Brian sat. He sat in that seat with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes forward. And he looked in that moment like a man who had decided that the only thing left to him was to make this as difficult as possible for everyone in his vicinity. "I am not moving," he said, "until someone explains to me how a child in economy managed to get assigned a first-class seat that I paid for." Mr. Ellis looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to Sophia. "Miss," he said, his voice gentler now, Could you please take the seat in the next row for just a few minutes while we sort this out? And here is where something happened that no one on that aircraft expected. Sophia shook her head, not defiantly, not dramatically, just clearly. "No, sir," she said. "That's not my seat. My seat is this one." Mr. Ellis looked at her. She looked back. For a moment, the whole first-class cabin breathed together and nobody said anything. And then, a passenger in a nearby row, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead and a paperback novel in her lap, began to clap. Once. Just once. And then she stopped, because she was a composed woman who did not make scenes. But the one clap had landed in that silence, like a stone dropped in still water, and the ripples went out and out and out through every row. Brian heard it. He heard the clap. He heard what it meant. And for the first time since he had settled into that seat, with the certainty of a man who had never truly been told no, he looked something other than certain. He looked at Sophia Carter. He looked at a young girl who had not raised her voice once, had not cried, had not backed down, had not moved, and the engine of the aircraft hummed low and steady beneath them. And the day outside the windows went on being bright, and the gate was still connected to the jetway, and this flight was going nowhere until someone decided what happened next. Brian Harlan had been given every opportunity. He had used none of them. And now the captain was coming. The boarding pass was still on the floor. Nobody had picked it up yet. That small rectangle of paper lay face up in the aisle of the first-class cabin, and every person within earshot of it understood exactly what it represented. Not just a seat assignment, not just a flight number, but the moment a grown man had decided with one sharp motion of his hand that a young girl's claim to her own space was something he could physically dismiss. Sophia had not moved. She was standing in the aisle with her arms still slightly raised, fingers still parted from where the paper had been knocked over. And she was doing the thing that she always did in moments that would have broken most people open. She was going still. Not frozen, not shut down. Still. The way a person goes still when they are deciding, very deliberately, what kind of person they are going to be in the next moment. Helen had seen that stillness before. She had seen it when a teacher told Sophia at a young age that her answer was wrong, and then realized shortly later that her answer had been the only correct one in the class. She had seen it when a boy at a math tournament laughed at Sophia's age and then watched her outscore him by a wide margin. She had seen it in many small moments, and every single time it appeared, something important happened afterward. Helen reached down and picked up the boarding pass. She smoothed it once against her palm, creasing it back flat, and placed it directly into Sophia's hand without a word. Sophia closed her fingers around it. She looked at Brian Harlan. He had already looked away. That was the thing about men like Brian. The act itself, the slap of his hand, the paper falling, had felt in the moment he did it like control, like authority, like the natural restoration of an order that a young girl had had the audacity to disturb. But now that it was done, now that it was real and witnessed and sitting in the air between him and the passengers who had all just seen it, he was looking at the headrest in front of him like it held the answers to a question he didn't want to be asked. Melissa had not moved either. She was standing a short distance from Brian with her hands clasped in front of her, and her face completely professional and completely unreadable. And she was doing what flight attendants are trained to do in situations that have escalated past the point of pleasant resolution. She was waiting. She was making sure she remembered everything. She was already composing in the back of her mind the exact language she would use in the incident report that was now absolutely going to be filed. It was Mr. Ellis who broke the silence. "Sir!" His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. There was a weight to it, the weight of decades managing crises at altitude that made the word land harder than a shout would have. "You just made physical contact with a passenger. I need you to stand up and come with me now." Brian turned his head slowly. "I barely touched it," he said. "It was a piece of paper." "It was her property," Mr. Ellis said, "and you removed it from her hand by force. That is a physical altercation on a commercial aircraft. You understand what that means for this flight." The temperature in the cabin dropped in the time it took Brian to process that sentence, because he did understand. Whatever else Brian Harlan was, he was not stupid. He knew what physical altercation on a commercial aircraft meant. He knew what incident reports meant. He knew what federal aviation regulations meant when they decided that a passenger had become a security concern. For the first time since he had settled into the seat with the bored confidence of a man who expected the world to arrange itself around him, Brian Harlan looked genuinely unsure of himself. "I didn't assault anyone," he said. "That is a ridiculous characterization of—" "Sir," Mr. Ellis again, quiet, immovable. "Please stand up." Brian looked around the cabin. He was looking for allies. That was clear. His eyes moved from face to face the way eyes move when they are searching for someone, anyone who will reflect back the version of events that feels most comfortable. Someone who will nod. Someone who will say, "Yes, this is an overreaction. Yes, the paper was nothing. Yes, the child should have just moved." He found no allies. What he found were phones, several of them, held at various angles, recording everything with the quiet, relentless patience of people who had learned in this particular era of the world that documentation was its own form of power. One of them belongs to a young black woman in a nearby row who had not said a single word since the confrontation began, but had positioned her phone with the calm efficiency of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing and exactly what needed to happen with the footage. Brian saw the phones. His jaw worked, and then slowly, stiffly, with the deliberate movement of a man who was performing compliance rather than feeling it, he stood up. The cabin seemed to exhale, but this was not the end. Mr. Ellis gestured toward the front of the aircraft, and Brian began walking, and as he passed Sophia, who had not moved, who was still standing in the aisle holding her boarding pass, he stopped. Just for a second, he stopped and he looked down at her, and his voice dropped to something that was technically too low for the surrounding seats to catch, but was absolutely unmistakably intended for her to hear. "Enjoy the seat," he said. "You won't be sitting in one like it again." Sophia looked up at him, and she said nothing. Not because she had nothing to say. Anyone who had been listening to her for the past few minutes knew she had plenty to say. She said nothing because she had learned something that most adults, many times her age, had not fully absorbed, that sometimes the most devastating response to cruelty is no response at all. That silence, chosen deliberately, is not weakness. It is refusal. It is the act of deciding that certain people are not worth the energy of your words. Brian walked past her. Mr. Ellis followed him. Melissa stayed. She looked at Sophia for a moment, and then she did something that was slightly outside the professional script, but entirely within the human one. She put her hand lightly on Sophia's shoulder, just for a second, and said quietly, "Go ahead and take your seat, sweetheart." Sophia walked the few steps to her row. She slid into the window seat. She put her backpack under the seat in front of her, the way she had been told to do. And she pressed her back against the cushion, and she looked out the window at the tarmac below, and at the sky above it. And she did not let herself cry. She did not let herself cry. Helen settled into the seat beside her, and without making a production of it, without drawing any more eyes toward them than were already there, she reached over and covered Sophia's hand with hers and held it. They sat like that for a while. The cabin began to resettle. Passengers shifted. Some people put their phones away. Some kept them out. A low murmur of conversation moved through the rows. The kind of murmur that follows something that everyone witnessed, and nobody has fully processed yet. Then the intercom clicked on, and the captain's voice filled the aircraft. His name was Captain William Hayes, and he had been flying commercial routes for many years. And he had the kind of voice that airports dream of putting on intercoms, clear, measured, authoritative without being cold. The voice of someone who will tell you there is turbulence ahead, but make you feel, somehow, that the turbulence will be entirely manageable. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes. We're going to be experiencing a brief delay before pushback today due to a passenger incident that required security intervention. I want to assure everyone that the situation is being handled and that your safety and comfort remain our absolute top priority. I'll update you as soon as I have more information on our departure time. Thank you for your patience. The intercom clicked off, and the murmur that moved through the cabin this time was different. It had an edge. Security intervention. 2 words that landed differently, depending on which seat you were sitting in and what you had just watched happen. For most of the passengers who had been watching, those 2 words felt like justice beginning to assemble itself, like the wheels of consequence turning, slowly but certainly in the right direction. For a handful of others, the ones who hadn't seen everything clearly, or who had seen it and made different calculations, those 2 words meant delay, inconvenience, time ticking away from connection flights and meeting schedules and carefully arranged plans. And it was one of those passengers who made the next mistake. He was in a nearby row, a man in his late 40s, business casual, laptop already open on the tray table. He had the look of someone who measured his days in productivity and found the current moment significantly lacking. He leaned forward in his seat toward the woman who had clapped earlier and said, loudly enough to carry several rows in each direction, "If that kid had just given up the seat, we'd already be taxiing." The woman looked at him over her reading glasses. "If that man had sat in his assigned seat," she said, "we'd already be at cruising altitude." He blinked, opened his mouth, closed it, but from somewhere behind him, farther back, another voice joined in. Seriously, though, 1 seat. Was it worth all this? And now something shifted in the cabin that was harder to name than anger, harder to contain than quiet, harder to ignore than a single raised voice. It was a division, a fault line running right down the middle of the aircraft between the people who had watched what happened and understood it, and the people who had watched what happened and measured it only by its cost to their afternoon. Sophia heard all of it. Helen felt her hand tighten slightly under her palm. She squeezed back just once and leaned slightly closer. "Don't," Helen said softly. "Not a warning, a gift. Don't let them pull you into their version of this story." Sophia kept her eyes on the window. "He hit the boarding pass out of my hand," she said. Her voice was very quiet, very level. "In front of everyone, and they're saying it's my fault." "Some people will always find a way to say it's your fault," Helen said. "That doesn't make it true, and it doesn't change what everyone else saw." Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many of them are going to post the videos?" Helen glanced at her. "Why?" "Because if they post it, people outside will see it. And if people outside see it, he can't say it didn't happen." Helen studied her face. The small, serious face with its enormous eyes and its young features arranged in an expression that belonged to someone much older. "You're already thinking about that?" Helen asked. "I've been thinking about it since the first phone came up," Sophia said. Helen sat with that for a second. Then she said quietly, "Your father is going to have a lot of feelings when I call him." "I know," Sophia said. "Wait until we land. Sophia, please. I don't want him to do anything. I don't want this to be about him. I want it to be about what happened." There was a long pause. Outside the window, a ground crew vehicle moved slowly past the aircraft. The jetway was still attached. They weren't going anywhere yet. "Okay," Helen said finally. "We wait until we land." Some time had passed since boarding began, and Brian Harlan was still on that plane. This was the part that the passengers didn't fully understand yet. The part that Captain Hayes had been careful not to detail in his announcement. Brian had not been removed. He had been moved. Escorted forward to a small area near the cockpit while ground security was contacted and the incident was documented. But removal required ground security personnel to board the aircraft, and ground security was currently occupied with a separate situation nearby. And until they arrived, Brian Harlan was in a kind of bureaucratic purgatory, off the seat, out of the cabin, but not yet off the plane. Mr. Ellis knew this. Melissa knew this. Brian knew this. And Brian, sitting in that small forward area with his arms crossed and his jaw set and some cooling off time behind him, had made a decision. He was going to fight this, not quietly, not through appropriate channels, not through the airline's customer service process like a reasonable human being. He was going to fight it the way men like Brian fought things, loudly, immediately, by demanding access to whoever was in charge and insisting on being heard before anyone else had finished speaking. He knocked on the cockpit door. Mr. Ellis appeared instead from the galley area, and Brian turned on him with the full force of accumulated grievance. "I want to speak with the captain," Brian said. "Not in an announcement, in person. I've been sitting in this area with no explanation, no apology, and no acknowledgement that there may have been an error on the airline's part. I have rights. I am a Platinum Elite member of this airline's frequent flyer program, and I am being treated like a criminal." Mr. Ellis looked at him steadily. "Captain Hayes is preparing for departure," he said. "I'll convey your concerns. I don't want you to convey them. I want to convey them myself." "That's not possible right now, sir." Brian's voice went up a register, just one, but it was enough. "Then I want to know, right now, whether this airline is going to compensate me for this experience. I want to know whether that child's ticket is going to be investigated. I want to know why a first-class seat was assigned to an unaccompanied minor." "She is not unaccompanied," Mr. Ellis said. "Her guardian is seated beside her. She looks young. She is young, and she is a ticketed first-class passenger with a confirmed reservation. Same as you, except her reservation is for the correct seat." Mr. Ellis paused just long enough. "Yours is not." Brian stared at him. "I don't know how that happened," he said. And for the first time since this whole thing began, there was something almost genuine in his voice. Not remorse, not yet, but a small crack in the absolute certainty. A sliver of something that might in a different man have grown into accountability. But Brian patched it immediately. "And I intend to find out," he said, "because someone made an error, and I am not the one who should be standing here." In her seat, Sophia had no way of knowing what was being said forward. But the woman in a nearby row, the one with the phone, whose name was Jessica, who was a middle school teacher from Atlanta, who was flying to Phoenix for her cousin's wedding, had been watching the forward area of the cabin with the careful attention of someone who was building a timeline. She had recorded the moment Brian knocked the boarding pass out of Sophia's hand, She had recorded the moment Mr. Ellis escorted him forward. She had recorded the reactions of the surrounding passengers, including the man and his comment about the seat. And now she pulled up her phone again and looked at the footage, and she made the same calculation that Sophia had made earlier. If this gets out, she thought, he can't erase it. She opened her social media app. She typed a caption. She typed it carefully, the way a teacher types things when she knows that words matter and that the internet is unforgiving of imprecision. Just watched a grown man slap a boarding pass out of a little girl's hand on my flight, and then refused to give up the seat he stole from her. She is young. She has not cried once. The flight is grounded and she is sitting in her seat. She attached a short clip of video. She posted it. And then she put her phone face down on her tray table and looked out the window and thought about how the world works and how slowly it changes and how sometimes the smallest human beings in the room are the only ones who know what justice actually looks like. At the front of the aircraft, the situation was reaching its own tipping point. Ground security had finally become available. 2 officers boarded through the forward door. Not aggressive, not dramatic, but present in the way that authority is present when it has made a decision and is simply arriving to execute it. They spoke briefly with Mr. Ellis. They looked at the incident documentation Melissa had been building. They turned to Brian. The shorter of the 2 officers spoke. "Mr. Harlan, we're going to need you to come with us." Brian looked at them. In his whole life, no one had ever escorted him off an aircraft. No one had ever looked at him the way these 2 officers were looking at him now, with the impersonal efficiency of people who had made similar requests many times, and who did not expect the next several minutes to be pleasant. "I am not going to be removed from this flight," Brian said. "You're not being removed," the officer said. "You're being asked to come with us to complete the incident documentation. Once that's finished, the airline will determine next steps." "Next steps?" Brian repeated. "Yes, sir." "And will those next steps include putting me back on this flight?" The officer looked at him for just a beat too long. "That will be the airline's decision," he said. Brian understood what that meant. Everyone in earshot understood what that meant. He looked back through the cabin, back down the narrow aisle, past the first-class rows, past Melissa and Mr. Ellis, and the phones and the watching faces, all the way to the row where a small girl with a backpack under her seat was sitting in the window seat, with her hand in her nanny's and her eyes on the sky. He didn't say anything, not because he had nothing to say, but because for the first time he was beginning to understand that nothing he said was going to change what had already happened. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the forward door and he stepped off the aircraft. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, a sound moved through the first-class cabin. Not wild, not celebratory, a quiet sound. The kind of sound that comes from people who have been holding their breath for a long time and have only just now remembered how to let it out. Someone began to clap, then someone else. Then the businessman with the laptop who had the decency to look slightly embarrassed as he added his own hands to it. It lasted a short time. When it stopped, the aircraft was quiet again. Mr. Ellis appeared in the cabin doorway and spoke in the direction of the first-class rows, his voice warm for the first time since the whole thing began. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our final boarding shortly. We apologize for the delay and we thank you for your patience." Sophia heard the applause. She had not turned around for it. She had kept her eyes on the sky outside the window. But she had heard it and she felt it in her chest in a way that was different from how she had felt Brian's words, different from how she had felt the paper leaving her fingers, different from how she had felt the passengers who had muttered about her fault. This felt, she thought, like something. She didn't have a word for it yet. She was young, and some feelings don't come with words ready-made. But it felt like something true. Like the world had for one moment looked directly at what happened and called it what it was. Helen squeezed her hand again. "You okay?" she asked. Sophia thought about it. Actually thought about it. The way she thought about math problems. Turning it over, checking it from multiple angles. "I think so," she said. "You don't have to be okay," Helen said. "Not yet." "I know," Sophia said, "but I think I am." Outside the window, the ground crew was moving with purpose now. The jetway began to retract. The engines deepened their hum, and somewhere on the internet, a short clip of video was already traveling faster than any aircraft. The flight was about to leave the ground. But the story had already taken off. The jetway disconnected with a sound like the world releasing a long-held breath. The flight began its slow pushback from the gate. Behind schedule. And Sophia Carter sat in her seat with her boarding pass folded in her jacket pocket, and her forehead close to the cold glass of the window, and she watched the airport begin to move away from her. She had not eaten breakfast. She'd been too excited that day to eat, and then too tense. And now the aircraft was rolling and the moment was finally genuinely over. Brian Harlan was off the plane. The applause had faded. The cabin had settled into the quiet rustling of people arranging themselves for a flight. And Sophia realized that her hands were shaking slightly. Not much. Not visibly, probably. But she could feel it. The fine tremor that comes not from the moment of danger, but from the moment after it. When your body finally understands that the danger has passed and decides, without consulting you, to release everything it was holding. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. She breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, several times, the way her father had taught her to do after her first math competition, when she had walked off the stage with the trophy, and then stood in the hallway and shook. "You're not scared," David Carter had told her then, kneeling down to her level in that hallway, his big hands wrapped around her small, trembling ones. "You're just catching up to yourself. Your mind handled everything. Now your body gets its turn." She remembered that now. Her body was catching up. Helen did not ask if she was okay again. She had said what she needed to say. Now she simply sat beside her, solid and present, the way she always was, not hovering, not performing concern, just there, the way good people are there when you need them to be. The aircraft reached the taxiway and paused, waiting for clearance. From behind them in the business class section, the murmur of conversation had shifted. The irritated edge that had been there earlier, the muttering about delays, the implication that Sophia's refusal to move was somehow the cause of all of this, had gone quieter, not silent. Not gone, but quieter. Because Brian Harlan had been escorted off by 2 security officers, and it is very difficult to maintain the position that the child was the problem when the adult has just been removed by law enforcement. Some people managed it anyway. That was the thing Sophia was learning, sitting in her seat while the aircraft waited for takeoff clearance. Some people would manage it anyway, not because the evidence wasn't clear, not because they hadn't seen exactly what happened, but because certain people have a deep structural need for the world to be arranged the way they already believe it is arranged. And when reality refuses to cooperate, they do not adjust their belief. They adjust their description of reality. She heard a man's voice from somewhere in the rows behind her, not the one who had spoken earlier. A different voice, older, further back, saying to whoever was seated next to him, "Still think the whole thing was overblown? Security over a seat dispute." Sophia did not turn around. She did not say anything. She looked out the window and watched the tarmac. and thought about her father, and about the phone call she was not going to make until they landed, and about the short clip of video that Jessica had posted, which Sophia did not know about yet. She would find out soon enough. The aircraft received clearance. It began to move. And then it was accelerating, and the city was blurring past the window, and the ground fell away, and Dallas became small and then smaller. And then the clouds came, and there was nothing outside the window but white and gray and the enormous, indifferent sky. And Sophia pressed her palm flat against the glass and felt the cold of it and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, I won. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just quietly, privately, the way you think a thing when it is only for you. I won. She had been told she didn't belong. She had been told to move. She had had something taken from her hand. She had been made into a problem, a delay, an inconvenience, a complication by a stranger, by a handful of irritated passengers, by the simple mathematics of a cabin full of people who wanted to be somewhere else. And she had stood in that aisle without raising her voice, without crying, without backing down. And she had held on to what was hers. And now she was sitting in her seat at cruising altitude. And Brian Harlan was somewhere in the airport terminal, dealing with the consequences of what he had chosen to do. That was what winning looked like sometimes. Not loud, not celebrated, just real. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime. And then Melissa appeared in the aisle. She was carrying a small tray, and on it was a glass of orange juice and a small plate of fruit, and a warm croissant wrapped in a linen napkin. She set it on the tray table in front of Sophia, with the careful deliberateness of someone who is making a gesture that has more weight than its surface suggests. From the crew, Melissa said quietly, and from me personally. Sophia looked at the tray, then at Melissa. Thank you, she said. Melissa nodded once, then. She looked at her with the kind of look that adults rarely give children. Direct, equal, without the softening that usually comes when adults address someone half their size. You were right, Melissa said, from the beginning, and you handled it better than most adults I've seen in my years of this job. She didn't wait for a response. She went back to her duties, moving through the cabin with the smooth efficiency of someone who had work to do, and had now said the thing she needed to say. Sophia looked at the orange juice. She picked it up and drank half of it in one long pull, and the cold of it went all the way down, and she realized she was desperately, completely thirsty, and that the shaking in her hands had stopped. Helen was looking at her. Eat, Helen said simply. Sophia ate. It was somewhere over the southwest, some time into the flight, that Jessica turned around in her seat. She had been sitting there since takeoff, with her phone face down on her tray table, doing exactly what she had told herself she would do, which was not look at the numbers. She was a teacher. She had made the post because it was the right thing to do, not because she wanted it to go anywhere. She had documented what happened because documentation mattered, not because she was chasing anything. But the phone had buzzed several times, and then more times, and then it had stopped buzzing and started vibrating almost continuously, the way phones do when the internet has found something and decided it belongs to everyone. She turned it over. The post had a huge number of shares. She stared at that number for a full moment. She looked at the comments. Not all of them. There were already too many to read. But enough. Enough to understand that the short clip of video had traveled very far and very fast, and that the world outside this aircraft had formed its opinion. And that opinion was loud and unified and pointed in one direction. She looked at the seat in front of her. She could see the top of Sophia's head, the neat braids, the small shoulders, and she thought about what to do with what she was holding. She made a decision. She tapped Helen's arm gently from behind. Helen turned. Jessica held up her phone so that Helen could see the screen. She didn't say anything. She just let the number speak. A huge number of shares. Helen looked at the number. Then she looked at Jessica. Then she looked at the back of Sophia's head. "How long has it been up?" Helen asked, her voice low. "Not long," Jessica said. Helen turned back around in her seat. She sat with that information for a long moment, looking forward, very still, in the way that Sophia sometimes went still, but different, not deciding, processing, running calculations of a different kind. The kind that involve a man named David Carter, who was going to see a video of his daughter having a boarding pass knocked out of her hand, and who was not going to respond to that quietly. "Does she know?" Jessica asked. "No," Helen said. "Do you want me to?" "Not yet," Helen said. "Let her eat." Sophia was finishing her croissant with the focused attention she gave to most things, unaware that many people had shared a piece of her day, unaware that the number was climbing, unaware that in offices and living rooms and coffee shops across the country, people were watching the short clip of her standing in an aisle and making decisions about what it meant. She was just eating a croissant at altitude. She was just a young girl who had been through something hard and had come out the other side and was hungry. That was the twist that was assembling itself, quietly and without her knowledge, somewhere between Dallas and Phoenix. Not a twist of confrontation, not a twist of violence or argument or official consequence. A twist of scale. The world was watching and she didn't know it yet. And the moment she found out was going to change every single thing about what happened next. The seatbelt sign chimed on again. The captain's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be hitting a bit of turbulence for the next few minutes as we pass through some weather. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please be seated as well." The aircraft shuddered once, twice. Sophia grabbed the armrest. Not because she was scared of turbulence. She had flown before, shorter flights with her father, and she knew what turbulence felt like. But the sudden physical jolt of it, after everything that had already happened in her body that day, sent a spike of adrenaline through her that landed harder than it should have. She breathed. She held the armrest and breathed. The aircraft steadied, and then, from behind her, she heard it. The voice she recognized. Not Brian Harlan. He was gone. But the voice of the man who had said if she had just given up the seat, the one who had found his own way to put the weight of everything on her shoulders. He was on a phone call, his voice low but not low enough, and he was saying to whoever was on the other end, "Yeah, I'm on the flight. The whole thing was insane. Some kid made a federal case out of a seat mix-up, and we ended up behind schedule. Her nanny was worse than she was." Sophia heard every word. Helen heard every word. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophia turned her head toward Helen and said, in a voice that was remarkably steady for someone who had just heard themselves described that way, "He thinks I made a federal case out of it." "I know," Helen said. "A man hit the boarding pass out of my hand." "I know. That's not a federal case. That's—" She stopped, searched for the word. "That's just what happened." Helen looked at her. "Some people," she said carefully, "have spent so long in a world that bends toward them that when they see it not bending, they call it broken. They call you the problem. They call your standing there a provocation. She paused. That's not your fault, and it's not your responsibility to fix. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made Helen's breath catch slightly. "If I were white," Sophia said, "and a man slapped the boarding pass out of my hand, would he still be saying I made a federal case out of it?" The question sat between them. Helen did not answer immediately, because Helen was older and had lived through things that Sophia had not yet lived through. And she believed, with the deep bone knowledge of hard experience, that children deserved honest answers to honest questions, not comfortable answers, not softened answers, honest ones. "No," she said, "he wouldn't." Sophia nodded once, like she had already known, like she was asking not because she needed the answer, but because she needed someone to say the truth out loud, so it existed in the air between them, and not just in her own head where it had been sitting, heavy and unconfirmed. "Okay," Sophia said, "just that." "Okay." She turned back to the window. The turbulence had passed. The sky outside was blue and enormous and completely indifferent to everything that had happened below it, or inside this aircraft, or in the heart of a young girl who was trying very hard to understand a world that was beautiful and unjust in almost equal measure. It was at this exact moment that Jessica's phone buzzed again. She looked at it. The number had climbed much higher, and there was a new notification. A reply from a verified account. A news account. A large one. It said, "We're covering this story. Do you have contact information for the family?" Jessica stared at that notification for a long time. She thought about Sophia's braids over the top of the seat back in front of her. She thought about Melissa's voice saying, "You handled it better than most adults I've seen." She thought about the sound of a boarding pass hitting the floor of an aircraft aisle, and what it meant when a grown man did that to a child, and then leaned back in the seat and crossed his arms and said, "No." She typed back. She said, "I'll ask." She tapped Helen's arm again. Helen turned. Jessica showed her the screen. Not just the share count this time, the news notification, the request for contact. Helen read it twice. Her expression didn't change the way most people's expressions change when they receive news. Helen's face had been through too much to change easily. But something in her eyes shifted. A calculation. A weighing. A mental conversation with a man named David Carter that hadn't happened yet, but was now completely inevitable. "What's your name?" Helen asked. "Jessica," the woman said. "Jessica Mills. I'm a teacher." Helen looked at her for a moment, reading her the way Helen read people, with the thorough efficiency of someone who had been doing it for a long time and was very rarely wrong. "Where are you staying in Phoenix?" Helen asked. "Downtown Marriott," Jessica said. Helen reached into her bag and produced a small card, plain, cream-colored, with nothing on it but a phone number and the initials HB. "Give me until tonight," Helen said. "I need to make a phone call first." Jessica took the card. She nodded. She understood, without needing it explained, that the phone call Helen needed to make was going to go very differently from what most phone calls go like, and that the name Sophia Carter was probably going to mean something different to the world by the time they landed than it had meant when they took off. Sophia, still facing the window, had heard none of this, or so Helen thought. Then Sophia said, without turning around, "Helen, how many shares?" Helen went still, a pause that was too long. "What?" Helen said. "The video. The woman in the row behind. How many shares?" Helen turned to look at her fully. Sophia was still facing the window. Her voice had been entirely calm. There was no tremor in it, no accusation, no dramatic reveal. She sounded exactly the way she always sounded, like someone who had already done the math and was now simply waiting for the other person to confirm the answer. "How did you know?" Helen asked. "I heard her phone buzzing," Sophia said. "And then I heard you and her whispering. And the only thing you would be whispering about that would make you go that quiet is if something got bigger than we thought." She paused. "How many?" Helen looked at Jessica. Jessica turned her phone around. The number on the screen had climbed even higher. Sophia finally turned from the window. She looked at the phone. She looked at the number. She looked at Helen. And her face did something that Helen had not seen it do since they had arrived at the airport that day. It did not harden. It did not compose itself. It did not go still with the careful, mature control of a child who had learned very young that the world respects restraint. It crumbled. Just for a second. Just briefly. Brief and real and entirely human. The way a face crumbles when something finally becomes too big to simply carry. And then Sophia pressed her lips together and pulled it back and turned toward the window and blinked twice fast and did not cry. But that second was real. Helen reached over and covered her hand again. "It's okay," Helen said softly. "It's a lot of people," Sophia said. Her voice was almost normal. Almost. "It is." They all watched it happen. "Yes." Sophia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you think he knows yet? Brian? Do you think he knows how many people watched?" Helen thought about that. She thought about a man named Brian Harlan sitting in the airport terminal while an incident report was completed, and the airline's customer service department prepared whatever they were about to say to a Platinum Elite member who had been removed from a flight for physically confronting a minor and refusing to comply with crew instructions. She thought about what it would feel like to be that man and to pick up your phone and see what the internet had decided you were. "I imagine," Helen said carefully, "that he is beginning to find out." Outside the window, the sky was still blue and enormous. The aircraft hummed forward through it steady and unhurried, cutting its way through the clouds toward Phoenix, toward landing, toward the moment when Helen would make her phone call, and David Carter would hear his daughter's name, and a share count in the same sentence, and the story would enter its next phase. Sophia pressed her palm against the window glass again. Cold. Solid. Real. She thought about what her father had said to her when he bought the ticket. You sit in that front seat and you look out that window and you remember that the world is bigger than anyone tries to tell you it is. She had not imagined when he said it that she would spend the flight proving it. But she was sitting in the front seat. She was looking out the window. And the world was in fact bigger than anyone had tried to tell her, in ways she was only beginning to understand. The descent into Phoenix began some time later, and Helen Brooks reached into her bag, took out her phone, and for the first time that day, called David Carter. It rang twice. He picked up on the third ring, and before he could say a single word, before he could ask how the flight was, or whether Sophia was excited, or whether the seats were everything she had hoped they would be, Helen said, "David, something happened. She's okay. She's completely okay, but you need to sit down." David Carter did not sit down. He was standing in his office in the Carter Tech building in downtown Dallas when Helen called. And when she said those words, "She's okay. She's completely okay, but you need to sit down," he did not sit down because men like David Carter do not sit down when someone tells them something happened to their child. They stand up straighter. They go still in a way that is nothing like calm. They become very, very focused. "Tell me," he said. His voice was quiet, continuous. The same voice he used in boardrooms when someone brought him information he did not like, when the numbers were wrong, or the strategy had failed, or someone had made a decision without understanding its full weight. The voice that his employees had learned over the years meant that he was not going to react until he had every single fact. And that once he had every single fact, his reaction was going to be precise and thorough and leave nothing unaddressed. Helen told him. She told him all of it, from the moment they boarded to the boarding pass, to Brian's voice, to the slap of his hand, to Melissa and Mr. Ellis, and the security officers and the applause, and Sophia sitting in her seat while the aircraft pushed back, and the share count that was now, as she was speaking, climbing higher. She told him calmly, sequentially, without editorializing, because that was how Helen delivered information, clean and complete, the way a surgeon hands a scalpel without drama and without omission. David listened to all of it, without interrupting. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted a moment. Then he said, "Where is she right now?" "Rose in front of me," Helen said. "She's looking out the window. She ate her breakfast. She's not crying. She's been... David, she has been extraordinary. I need you to understand that before I tell you what I'm about to say." "What are you about to say?" "I need you to hear me when I say she doesn't want you to make this about your power. She specifically asked me not to call you until we landed, because she didn't want you to do anything." Another silence, shorter this time. "She asked you not to call me." "She asked me to wait until we landed. I'm calling you now because what I'm holding in my hand is a phone with a high share count on it, and a news organization that wants the family's contact information. And that decision is above my pay grade, David. That decision is yours." David Carter turned to the window of his office. The Dallas skyline spread out below him. The city he had built a company in. The city where he had raised his daughter after her mother left. The city where he had learned over and over again in boardrooms and conference rooms and industry dinners, and 100 other rooms that had not been built with men like him in mind, exactly what the world thought of a black man, with money and ambition, and the nerve to sit in the front seat. He thought about a boarding pass hitting an aircraft floor. He thought about a stranger's hand. He thought about his young daughter standing in an aisle and being told she didn't belong. His jaw tightened once. Then he made two decisions, one right after the other, with the speed of a man who has spent years making decisions and knows how to separate the ones that need time from the ones that don't. "Don't give the news organization anything yet," he said. "Tell the woman with the phone, Jessica. Tell her to hold. I'll be in Phoenix before tonight." "David, the conference. Cancel it. It's the quarterly." "Helen." His voice had not changed in volume or temperature, but she stopped because she knew that voice. That was the voice that meant the conversation about whether to cancel the conference was already over. "Cancel the quarterly. Clear tomorrow. Book me on the next flight to Phoenix." "Okay," Helen said. "And Helen..." "Yes?" "Tell her I'm proud of her. Don't make it a big thing. Just tell her." Helen looked up the aisle at the back of Sophia's head. "I will," she said. She ended the call. She looked at Jessica over the seat back and shook her head once. "Not yet." And Jessica nodded and put her phone in her lap. Then Helen leaned forward and touched Sophia's arm. Sophia turned. "Your father says he's proud of you," Helen said. "He says don't make it a big thing." Sophia looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of her mouth moved just slightly, just barely, the ghost of something that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. Did he cancel the quarterly? She asked. Helen raised an eyebrow. How did you... Because that's what he does when something matters to him more than money, Sophia said. She turned back to the window. He cancels the quarterly. Helen sat back in her seat and thought that David Carter had made an extraordinary child and probably did not fully understand the extent of it. The wheels of the flight touched down at Phoenix Sky Harbor, and the aircraft taxied to the gate with the ordinary, unhurried patience of a plane that has completed its crossing and is in no particular hurry about the final stretch. Most of the passengers gathered their bags and checked their phones and mentally pivoted to whatever came next in their day. The businessman stood up before the seatbelt sign turned off and was gently reminded to sit back down. The woman who had given the single clap looked across the aisle at Sophia as she stood to retrieve her bag from the overhead bin and said simply, "Well done, young lady," and then moved into the aisle without waiting for a response, which was the most elegant possible way to deliver a compliment. Melissa appeared one last time as the passengers filed out. She stopped at the row. She looked at Sophia with an expression that had shed all its professional layering and was just a person looking at another person. "I'm going to remember you," Melissa said. "I want you to know that." Sophia looked back at her. "Thank you for checking the manifest," Sophia said. Melissa laughed a short, surprised, genuine laugh and shook her head. "That's the part you're thanking me for?" "It's the part that mattered," Sophia said. "If you hadn't checked, everything else would have been different." Melissa stood there for just a moment longer, and then she nodded once, and there was something in that nod that was both agreement and acknowledgement. The recognition of one person by another across the particular distance that age and experience and circumstance create between people. A distance that Sophia kept crossing before anyone expected her to reach it. They walked off the aircraft and into the jetway, and the jetway was ordinary and close and smelled like airport smell. And Sophia Carter walked through it with her backpack on and her boarding pass in her pocket, and her nanny's hand not in hers anymore because she was young, and she was walking and she was fine. And she stepped into the terminal and stopped because there were cameras, not phone cameras, real ones. News cameras shoulder-mounted with vans probably somewhere in the pickup area outside, and reporters with microphones, 2 of them, standing near the gate area with a particular alertness of people who have been told a story is arriving on this flight and are positioned to meet it. Sophia stopped walking. Helen came up beside her immediately. Jessica, coming off the jetway a few steps behind them, saw the cameras and her step faltered. And she looked at Helen with an expression that said, "I did not do this. I only gave them the gate number, because they already..." And Helen gave her a look that was not angry but was firm and said, "We'll talk later." One of the reporters had already spotted them. She was a woman in her 30s in a blazer, and she had the kind of trained peripheral vision that reporters develop, the ability to locate the story in a crowd before the crowd has finished moving. She took 2 steps forward. "Excuse me, are you Sophia Carter?" Sophia looked at her. She looked at the camera. She looked at Helen. Helen stepped forward slightly, placing herself in the narrow space between Sophia and the reporter without making it look like a barrier. She had the particular talent of protection that doesn't announce itself. "We're not making any statements at the airport," Helen said pleasantly. "The family will be in touch through appropriate channels." The reporter pivoted smoothly, the way reporters do. "Can you confirm that Sophia Carter was the child involved in the incident on the flight this morning?" "I can confirm," Helen said, "that we'd like to collect our luggage." She put her hand lightly on Sophia's shoulder and moved, but Sophia did not move. She was looking at the reporter, not at the camera. At the reporter, at her face, at the microphone, and she was doing that thing again, that stillness, that calculation, That internal conversation that happened in the space behind her eyes, when she was deciding who she was going to be in the next moment. Helen felt her not moving and looked down at her. "Sophia," she said quietly. "I want to say something," Sophia said. "Your father said my father said he was proud of me," Sophia said. "He didn't say don't talk." Helen considered that for a moment. It was technically accurate. Helen looked at the reporter, at the camera, at the gate area that was now being watched by arriving passengers who had slowed or stopped when they saw the cameras, adding an audience to an audience. She looked at Sophia. "Short," Helen said. "Clear. Your own words." Sophia nodded. She took one step forward and looked directly at the reporter. "You can ask me one question," she said. Her voice was clear and even, not performed, not rehearsed, just her voice, the one she always used. The reporter, to her credit, recalibrated immediately. She was looking at a young girl who had just told her she could ask one question, and she was processing the fact that this child was not trembling, was not looking to her nanny for reassurance, was not doing any of the things that children typically do when put in front of cameras. She was just standing there, waiting with the focused patience of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. The reporter asked, "What do you want people to understand about what happened on that flight today?" Sophia did not hesitate. "That it wasn't about a seat," she said. "It was about whether I was going to be told I didn't belong somewhere that was already mine. And I wasn't going to do that. Not because I was brave, because it was just true. The seat was mine. The boarding pass had my name. The truth doesn't change because someone bigger than you wants it to." She stopped. That was it. That was all. The reporter stood there for a half second too long. Then she said almost involuntarily, "Thank you." Sophia nodded once. She turned back to Helen. "Luggage," she said. And they walked. Behind them, the camera was still rolling. And somewhere in the Dallas airport terminal, Brian Harlan was having a very different kind of day. He had been processed through the incident documentation, which was thorough, and which he had refused to sign and released by the security officers with the understanding that the airline's customer relations department would be contacting him regarding the incident and regarding his membership status. He had collected his carry-on bag from the jetway staff who had retrieved it from the aircraft, and he had stood in the terminal with his bag and his jacket and his pride and his absolute unshakable conviction that he had been wronged by a system that had failed him. He had pulled out his phone. He had intended to call the airline's executive customer service line, the one for Platinum Elite members, the one with a real human being instead of a menu. But the first thing that came up on his screen was not the airline's number. It was a notification from a news aggregator he had installed some time ago to track business headlines. The notification said, "Viral. Child's boarding pass knocked away on flight. Over many shares." Brian looked at that notification for a long time. He clicked it. The article loaded. It was brief. It had been written fast, the way articles are written when the internet moves faster than the reporting, but it had the video embedded at the top, the short clip. His hand, the paper, the floor, his face turning away. Brian watched it once. He watched it again. He watched it a third time, and this time he was not watching what he had done. He was watching how it looked. He was watching the short clip of himself through the eyes of the many people who had already watched it. And he was understanding with a nauseating clarity that had not been available to him inside the cabin what those people had seen. Not a seat dispute, not a mix-up, not a Platinum Elite member asserting a right. A grown man hitting a boarding pass out of a child's hand. His phone buzzed. It was his wife. He answered it. Brian. Her voice was not the voice she used when she was worried about him. It was the voice she used when she was embarrassed by him. And he had heard that voice before, but never quite like this. This tight, this low, this carefully controlled. "Tell me you are not the man in that video." He closed his eyes. "It's being misrepresented," he said. "Brian, I watched the video. Our son watched the video. His school called because other parents are texting him about it." A pause that was exactly the length of a decision being made. "You need to come home and you need to figure out what you're going to say, because right now, the only thing anyone is seeing is you knocking something out of a little girl's hand." Brian sat down on a terminal bench. He sat there with his phone against his ear and his carry-on between his knees, and the day passing around him, all the ordinary movement of an airport. And he looked at the floor and thought about a boarding pass lying face up in an aisle. "It wasn't like that," he said. "Then what was it like?" his wife asked. He had no answer for that. Not one that worked. Not one that would sound like anything other than what it had been. Meanwhile, in Phoenix, Sophia and Helen had retrieved their single rolling suitcase from baggage claim and were moving toward the exit when Helen's phone buzzed again. She looked at it. It was a text from a number she didn't have saved. It said, "This is Lisa Bennett, VP of Customer Relations at the airline. We would very much like to speak with Ms. Carter's family at your earliest convenience. We want to make this right." Helen read it twice. She showed it to Sophia without comment. Sophia read it. Then she looked up at Helen. "What does making it right look like?" she asked. It was such a precise question that Helen almost laughed. "That," she said, "is exactly the right thing to ask." She typed back, "The family will be in touch. Please direct further communication to this number." She sent it. She put her phone away. They walked through the automatic doors and out into the Phoenix air, which was dry and warm and enormous the way desert air is enormous. And Sophia stopped for just a moment and tilted her face up toward the sky. It was the first time she had been outside since early that day. It felt different than it had then. Everything did. She breathed in once, deeply, and then she looked at Helen and said, "When does Dad's flight land?" "Later this evening," Helen said. "That's some hours." "Yes." Sophia nodded. She started walking again, but Helen caught her arm. "Sophia." Her voice was careful. "Before tonight, before your father lands, and the airline calls, and the news people call, and all of it starts moving the way it's about to move, I need you to hear me." Sophia stopped. She turned. Helen looked at her with the full weight of her experience in years with this specific child and everything she had watched happen. In the past hours. "What you did today," Helen said, "was not small. I know it felt to you like you were just doing the obvious thing, the true thing. I know it felt like you were just standing in an aisle holding a piece of paper. But I need you to understand that most people, most grown people, most people who have lived much longer than you would not have done what you did. They would have moved. They would have told themselves it wasn't worth it, or that fighting wasn't dignified, or that someone else would handle it, or that the seat was just a seat." Sophia was looking at her steadily. "The seat was just a seat," she said. "You're right about that." "No," Helen said. "The seat was never just a seat, and you knew that. You knew it from the moment he looked at you and said what he said. And you stood there anyway." She paused. "That is not a small thing." Sophia held that. She held it the way she held difficult equations, not dismissing it, not rushing to a conclusion, letting it sit until she understood its full weight. Then she said, "I was scared." Helen blinked. "The whole time," Sophia said. "I didn't show it because I didn't want him to see it. But I was scared. My hands were shaking the whole time I was standing in that aisle. I didn't let the scared part decide what I did. I let the true part decide." Helen looked at her for a long, full moment. Her eyes were bright. She did not cry. Helen Brooks did not cry in airports or in front of cameras or in situations that required her to be steady. But her eyes were very bright. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly what courage is." Sophia absorbed that. Then she said, "Okay," and she started walking again, toward the rideshare pickup area, toward the hotel, toward the hours before her father landed and the world that was assembling itself around what had happened started to arrive. She walked like a girl who was tired and hungry, and had been through a great deal since breakfast and wanted to put her backpack down. She walked like a girl who had done the right thing and knew it and was done explaining it. She walked like Sophia Carter. Behind her, somewhere between Dallas and Phoenix, on a different flight that David Carter had booked shortly after hanging up with Helen, a man who had built a billion-dollar company from a desk in a one-bedroom apartment sat in his seat with his phone in his hand and a video on the screen. The short clip, his daughter's hand, the paper falling. He watched it several times. On the last time, he turned off the screen and looked out the window at the country passing below him, the flat brown reach of Texas giving way to the red rock expanse of New Mexico, and he pressed his fist against his mouth and stayed very still for a very long time. Then he opened his phone again. He did not call the airline. He did not call his lawyers. He did not call any of the people that a man in his position calls when something needs to be addressed with weight and consequence. He called Sophia. It rang twice. "Dad." Her voice, small and clear and so completely hers. "Hey, baby girl," he said. His voice almost held. Almost. "Are you crying?" Sophia asked. He laughed short and rough. "No. You sound like you're crying. I'm on a plane. That's not an answer." "How are you?" he asked. A pause. "I'm okay," she said. "I really am. I got the seat. I know you did. And I didn't cry." "I know that too." Another pause. Softer. "Dad," she said, "don't do anything big, okay? Just come. I just want to see you. I don't want it to be a whole thing." David Carter looked out of the window at New Mexico. He thought about everything he wanted to do, all the very specific, very targeted, very effective things that a man with his resources could do when someone hurt his child. He thought about the airline and the video and Brian Harlan and every single lever he could pull. He thought about his daughter's voice saying, "Just come." "Okay," he said. "Promise?" "I promise," he said. "I'm just coming to see you." He meant it. For now, he meant it completely. But Brian Harlan didn't know that yet, and the airline did not know that yet. And the world that was watching the share count climb higher did not know that yet. They would all find out by morning. David Carter landed at Phoenix Sky Harbor in the evening. He did not have a security detail with him. He did not have a publicist or a lawyer or any of the people who typically traveled with a man of his profile when something public was happening. He had a carry-on bag and a phone that had been buzzing since Dallas, and a promise he had made to his daughter that he intended to keep for as long as he possibly could. He called Helen from the jetway. "What floor?" he said. "The 8th floor," she said. "Room number." "She's awake." She waited. He moved through the terminal with the particular speed of a man who is not running, but is covering ground faster than most people run. And he did not stop for the woman near the baggage claim who recognized him and said his name. And he did not stop for the news van. He could see through the terminal glass at the curb outside. And he got into the rideshare that Helen had prearranged. And he sat in the back seat and looked at his phone. The share count was high. He put the phone face down on the seat beside him and looked out the window at Phoenix moving past in the dark. He thought about a boarding pass on a floor. He thought about his daughter's voice saying, "I didn't cry." He thought about the word courage and what it costs a person to spend it young before the world has given them any reason to believe it will be rewarded. The rideshare pulled up to the hotel. He was out of the car before it fully stopped. He knocked twice. The door opened, and Sophia Carter stood there in the hotel doorway in her socks and her travel clothes with her braids slightly loose from the day, and her eyes wide and clear and completely dry, exactly as she had told him they would be. And David Carter, who had built a company from nothing and sat across tables from people who tried to diminish him every year of his adult life, and had never once in a boardroom shown a single thing he didn't intend to show, went down on one knee in a hotel hallway and pulled his daughter into his arms and held her. She held him back. She pressed her face into his shoulder and held on with both arms, and neither of them said anything for a long time. When he finally pulled back and looked at her face, she was still not crying, but she was looking at him with an expression that was so old and so young at the same time that it stopped his breath for a second. "I got the seat," she said. His throat worked. "You got the seat," he said. She nodded once, and then she stepped back from the doorway and let him in. Helen was sitting at the small table by the window, with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and she looked at David with the particular expression of a woman who has been holding a great deal together for a very long time and is now, for the first time, willing to set some of it down. "Thank you," David said to her. It was 2 words, but Helen had known David Carter for some time, and she understood exactly how much was compressed into them. And she nodded once and took a sip of her tea and said, "She did the work. I just stood next to her." David sat on the edge of the bed across from the small table, and Sophia sat beside him, and they stayed like that for a while, the 3 of them in a hotel room in Phoenix, while the world outside that room churned through what had happened and decided what it meant. Then David said, "Tell me what you need." Sophia looked at him. "I need to understand what happens next," she said, to him. David looked at her carefully. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them and thought about it with the focused thoroughness she applied to every problem, turning it over, checking every angle. "I don't want to destroy him," she said finally. That's not what this was about." David waited. "But I don't want it to disappear either," she said. "I don't want it to just be a viral video that everyone forgets in a week. Because if it disappears, then the only thing that happened is that a man hid a boarding pass out of my hand and nothing changed." She paused. "I want something to change," she said. David Carter looked at his daughter. He thought about everything he could do. He had been thinking about it for the duration of 2 flights. He had run through every option with the systematic completeness of a man who built systems for a living. And he had arrived at a strategy, but he had told himself he would not deploy it until he heard from her, until he understood what she needed. Now he understood. "Okay," he said, "here's what I'm thinking. But I want your opinion on every part of it." Sophia uncrossed her arms. She was listening the way she always listened to him when he talked business, completely, without interruption, storing everything. He told her his plan. It was not what anyone outside that room would have expected. It was not a lawsuit. though the grounds were there. It was not a press statement demanding blood, though the public appetite for one was clearly enormous. It was not the kind of move that men with his resources typically make when someone wrongs them publicly. The kind that is designed to be maximally destructive to the person on the other end. It was something more precise than that. He had already spoken on the flight to Lisa Bennett, the airline's VP of Customer Relations. He had not called her to threaten or to demand. He had called her to listen. And what he heard was a woman who was genuinely shaken by what had happened on her airline, and who understood, without needing it explained, that the gap between what should have happened and what did happen was one that her company needed to reckon with publicly. He proposed something. He proposed that the airline use this moment, not erase it, not manage it, but use it to commit to a specific, measurable overhaul of crew training around passenger conflict resolution. And to do it publicly, with Sophia's story as the reason, not in the vague, corporate language way that companies make commitments when they are trying to make headlines go away, in the specific, auditable, follow-upable way that actually changes behavior. And he proposed that the airline fund something else, a scholarship, not a symbolic one, a real one. Annual, substantial, administered independently. For young students who demonstrated academic excellence and who came from communities that the aviation industry had historically overlooked, named with Sophia's permission, after her. Not after the incident. After her. When he finished explaining, Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will they actually do it?" "That depends," David said, "on whether the public pressure stays on long enough to make the cost of not doing it higher than the cost of doing it." "And is it?" Sophia asked. "High enough?" David looked at his phone. "It's getting there," he said. Sophia thought about it. "The scholarship," she said. "I want it to be for math, specifically." "Done," he said. "And I want to be involved in selecting recipients, not just my name on it, actually involved." "Done." She was quiet for one more moment. Then she said, "What about Brian?" The name landed in the room differently than all the other words. David's jaw worked once. Helen's hands tightened slightly around her tea, because this was the question that everything else circled around, the one with the most heat, the one that the internet had been answering loudly and without nuance for some time. Destroy him. Expose him. End him. With the full force of a public that had watched the short clip of video and arrived at a verdict before the aircraft had even landed. "What do you want?" David asked again. Sophia looked at the floor for a moment. "I want him to have to say it out loud," she said. "Not in a statement his lawyer wrote, not in a press release. I want him to say out loud, with his own words, what he did and what it meant." David looked at her. "A public apology," he said. "A real one," she said. "Not a sorry if anyone was offended. Not a sorry the situation was misunderstood. A real one, where he says what he actually did." She paused. "And I want to decide whether I accept it," she said. "Not you. Me." The room was quiet. David nodded slowly. "Then that's what we ask for," he said. Helen set down her tea. She had been listening to this conversation with the careful attention of someone who understood that they were witnessing something that was not common. A father and a daughter negotiating justice together, at the same level, with equal weight given to both voices. And the daughter's voice setting the terms. She had watched David Carter build a company. She had watched him win and lose and pivot and persist. She had watched him be David Carter in all the complicated fullness of that, but she had never watched him be this still, this deferential, this genuinely led by his child. It was, she thought, the best thing she had ever seen him do. Outside the hotel, Phoenix was doing what Phoenix does at night, warm and wide and spread out in every direction. The lights of the city going all the way to the mountains. And somewhere in that city, in a different hotel, Jessica Mills was lying on her bed, with her phone on her chest, and watching the notification count, and thinking about a card with the initials HB and a number on it. She had kept her word. She had held. She had not spoken to the news organizations that had found her account and messaged her. She had not given interviews. She had not built a platform on the short clip of someone else's day. She was a teacher from Atlanta going to her cousin's wedding, but she had done the thing she could do, and the thing she could do had mattered. And now she was lying in the dark thinking about a little girl in the row with her boarding pass held like a shield, and she was thinking that some days you are just in the right place at the right time. And the only question is whether you do something with it. She had done something with it. That was enough. The next morning arrived with the particular clarity of Phoenix mornings, sharp and dry and bright in a way that Dallas mornings rarely are. And it arrived carrying news. Brian Harlan had issued a statement. David's assistant sent it to him early, and he read it in the hotel room while Sophia was still asleep in the other bed, and Helen had gone for coffee. He read it twice. Then he put the phone down on the nightstand and sat with it for a long moment. The statement was what Sophia had predicted it would be. It was several paragraphs of careful language assembled by someone who was paid to make things sound like apologies without actually being apologies. It used the phrase, "I regret that my actions were perceived as," and the phrase, "in the heat of the moment," and the phrase, "any distress caused to the young passenger." It did not say what he had done. It did not say what it had meant. It referred to Sophia as the young passenger throughout, as if naming her was a concession he was unwilling to make. It was, David thought, the statement of a man who had been shown the video and the share count and the consequence, and had decided that the minimum possible acknowledgement was the appropriate response. He set the phone down. He was still looking at it when Sophia woke up. She sat up in bed and looked at him with the immediate clarity of a child who did not have groggy mornings, who came fully online the moment her eyes opened. And she saw his expression. He issued a statement, she said. It was not a question. Yes. Is it real? He picked up the phone and handed it to her. She read it. She read it slowly, which was not how she usually read things. And David watched her face as she moved through it, watched the slight tightening around her eyes, watched the very small flattening of her mouth, watched the moment she reached the phrase, "the young passenger," and blinked once. She handed the phone back. "No," she said simply. "No. It's not real. He doesn't say what he did. He doesn't say my name. He says he regrets that his actions were perceived." She paused. Perceived. The word sat there. David said nothing. "He still thinks," Sophia said, "that the problem is how people saw it, not what he did." She was quiet for a moment. Then she sat up straighter and said, "Okay, then we don't accept it." David looked at her. "We respond," she said, "publicly. And we say exactly why it's not enough." This was the twist that Brian Harlan had not accounted for. He had assumed, as men like Brian often assume, that the response to his statement would be one of two things. Either acceptance, because the statement had been carefully constructed to be technically difficult to refuse, or escalating aggression, because aggression is easy to dismiss as disproportionate. He had not accounted for the third option. which was a young girl responding to his paragraphs of careful language with sentences of precise, unsparing truth, because that is what Sophia Carter did. David called Lisa Bennett early. He told her what Sophia wanted to do. There was a pause on the line, and then Lisa Bennett said, "Mr. Carter, with respect, let her." Later that morning, the Carter Tech Communications team posted a response on their company's official social media. It was attributed to Sophia Carter because it was her words, written by her, checked only for spelling, with nothing added and nothing softened. It read, "Mr. Harlan's statement says he regrets that his actions were perceived a certain way. But my boarding pass was in my hand, and then it was on the floor. That is not a perception. That is what happened. I am young. I won a national math competition. My father bought me a first-class ticket as a reward, and my seat number was printed on my boarding pass. I showed it to him twice. He told me first class wasn't for kids like me. I want him to say what he meant by that. Not what it looked like. What he meant. When he is ready to say that, I am ready to listen." She signed it with her full name, Sophia Carter. The post went up. By midday, it had been shared many times. By the afternoon, Brian Harlan's name was the top trending topic on every major platform in the country, and the conversation had shifted from what happened to what he was going to do next. And the pressure of that shift, the weight of the shares and a young girl asking him directly, publicly by name to say what he meant, was a different kind of pressure than the kind he had faced at the airport. At the airport, he had faced a child. Now he was facing a mirror. His wife called him later. She did not say hello. She said, "Brian, read what she wrote." He had already read it. "She is young," his wife said. "She is asking you to be honest, and you are sitting there letting your publicist handle it. Diane, no." Her voice was flat and clear and entirely finished with the version of this conversation where she allowed him to explain. "I have been married to you for many years. I know who you are. I know you are not a bad man. But I also know what I saw in that video, and I know what I heard when I asked you about it on the phone, and I know the difference between a man who made a mistake and a man who is sorry he got caught." She paused. "Which one are you going to be?" The silence that followed lasted a long time. Brian Harlan sat in his hotel room with his phone against his ear, and his publicist's carefully drafted second statement on the laptop in front of him, and his wife's voice in his ear, and a young girl's words on every screen in the country. And he felt for the first time in this entire experience the full weight of what he had actually done. Not the legal weight, not the reputational weight, the human weight. A child had held out a piece of paper that had her name on it and proved she belonged somewhere, and he had knocked it out of her hand. He closed the laptop. "Diane," he said, "I need to make a call." The call he made was not to his publicist. It was to the Carter Tech Communications number listed at the bottom of Sophia's post. He asked to speak with David Carter. David took the call. He put it on speaker quietly so that Sophia, sitting a short distance away at the hotel table with her orange juice, could hear. He looked at her first, raising an eyebrow. "Okay?" She nodded. Brian's voice came through the speaker. It was different from the voice on the aircraft, not smaller exactly, but stripped of something. The performance was gone. What was left underneath was a man's voice, tired, middle-aged, caught. "Mr. Carter," Brian said, "I'd like to speak with your daughter." David looked at Sophia. She leaned forward slightly toward the phone. "I'm here," she said. A pause. "Sophia," Brian said. Her name. Her actual name. The first time he had used it. She noticed. She said nothing. "I owe you an apology," Brian said. "Not the one my publicist wrote. A real one." Another pause, longer this time. "What I did on that aircraft was wrong. Not wrong because I got caught. Wrong because you were right. You had your boarding pass. You showed it to me twice. And instead of moving, I decided that my discomfort was more important than you were right to be there." He stopped. "And when I say kids like you, He stopped again. "I heard it back on the video. I heard what it sounded like. I know what it sounded like, because I know what I meant." The hotel room was very quiet. Sophia was looking at the phone. "What did you mean?" she asked. It was the question she had written in her post, the one she had asked publicly. She was asking it now, directly. Just the two of them, her and this man, and the space between what he had done and what he was willing to say. Brian took a breath. "I meant," he said slowly, "that you were young and I looked at you and I made a decision about who you were and where you belonged before you said a single word. And that was about me, not you." Sophia was still looking at the phone. She was very still. Then she said, "Did you know you were doing it?" The question was so direct that it landed in the room like something physical. Brian was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. And then, after another beat, "That's the part that is the hardest to say, because if I'd known I was doing it, I could tell myself it was a choice. But I didn't know. I saw you and I decided without thinking." He paused. "That's worse, isn't it?" It was not a question. Sophia absorbed that. She looked at her father. David was looking at her with the same expression he'd had since he arrived at the hotel. The expression that said, "This is your moment. This is your call. I am here and I am not deciding." She looked back at the phone. "Yes," she said to Brian. "It is worse because if you didn't know you were doing it, then you've probably done it before to other people, and they didn't have a boarding pass to hold up." Brian had no answer for that, which was itself an answer. "I accept your apology," Sophia said. "I want you to know I accept it. But I need you to do something." "What?" Brian said. "I need you to say this publicly, the same way you just said it to me. Not a statement. Your voice. Your actual words." She paused. "Because there are other people watching this who look like you, and they need to hear you say that you didn't know you were doing it, and that is worse. Not me. I know it. I know. I need them to hear it." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. When Brian Harlan spoke again, his voice was rough in a way that voices get when a person is dealing with something they cannot manage back down. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Sophia said. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll record it myself. No publicist." Sophia looked at David. David gave her a single, small nod. "Thank you," Sophia said. She leaned back from the phone. And that was the moment. That was the one that nobody outside that room witnessed. The one that did not get shared widely, because it happened in a hotel room in Phoenix, between a young girl and a man she had every right to want to destroy, and had chosen instead to ask for the harder thing. The harder thing was the truth. The harder thing was always the truth. Brian Harlan posted his video statement sometime later. No script, no production, just a phone camera and a man in a room saying, in his own voice, the things he had said to Sophia Carter. He said her name. He said what he had done. He said the part about not knowing and the part about that being worse. He did not cry because Brian Harlan was not a man who cried easily. But he also did not perform composure. He simply sat in front of the camera and told the truth the way she had asked him to tell it. The internet received it with the mixed complexity that the internet always brings to things that are genuinely complicated. Some people called it too little, too late. Some people called it more than they expected. Some people called it nothing. Some people watched it and said nothing publicly, but sat very still in their living rooms and thought about the last time they had looked at someone and decided who they were before a word was spoken. That last group was the largest. It was the group Sophia had been talking to. Sometime later, the airline announced the training overhaul and the scholarship. The scholarship was for mathematics. It was annual. It was substantial. It was named the Sophia Carter Award for Excellence in Mathematics, and the first application cycle opened and received many submissions quickly. Sophia sat at her father's desk in the Carter Tech Building and read applications for some time that weekend morning. David sat across from her and watched her work and did not say anything because she did not need him to say anything. She had a notepad beside her, and she was writing down names, the ones that moved her, the ones that showed the things she recognized. The quality she did not have a precise word for, but knew the shape of exactly. The quality of a person who does the true thing, even when the true thing is hard. She found several of them in the first application cycle. Several kids. She wrote their names on her notepad in neat, careful handwriting and set the pen down and looked at what she had written. David was watching her. "You okay?" he asked. She looked up. "I'm thinking," she said, "about how many of these kids have already been in an aisle somewhere, already been told they don't belong, already been made to feel like the seat wasn't theirs." David said nothing. "I want them to know," she said quietly, "that the seat is theirs before someone tries to take it." He looked at his daughter, this young person who had woken up one morning to catch a flight and come home having changed something in the world, not because she had extraordinary power, but because she had refused to move when she knew she was right. He thought about a boarding pass in her hand and a day at the airport, and a flight that grounded itself rather than leave her standing in that aisle. He thought about everything she had done since then, and then he thought about what she had just said. "I want them to know the seat is theirs before someone tries to take it." And he understood fully and finally that his daughter was not going to need him to protect her from the world. She was going to change it, and she had already started, not with power, not with money, not with anything except a boarding pass with her name on it, and the absolute refusal to let anyone tell her it meant less than it said. That was enough. That had always been enough. And Sophia Carter, sitting at her father's desk in Dallas with several names on a notepad, and a scholarship in her own name and a world that had watched her stand in an aisle and learn something from what it saw, picked up her pen and went back to work. Because the seat was hers. It had always been hers, and she had never needed anyone's permission to sit in it. Sometimes the most powerful lessons in life don't come from classrooms or textbooks. They arrive in the quiet aisle of an airplane when a 10-year-old girl refuses to surrender what is rightfully hers. Sophia Carter taught us all something profound that day. True courage isn't loud shouting or dramatic gestures. It's the steady, unshakable decision to stand in your truth even when your hands are trembling, your heart is racing, and the whole world seems to be telling you to shrink, to move, to disappear. She showed us that belonging isn't something you beg for. It's something you calmly claim when you know, deep in your bones, that the seat is already yours. And in doing so, she reminded every one of us that the smallest voices, when rooted in dignity and quiet strength, can shake the conscience of grown men, shift the culture of an airline, and ripple across millions of screens, changing hearts we may never meet. Her story whispers a gentle but fierce truth. Never let anyone convince you that your place in this world is negotiable. Hold your boarding pass, whatever form it takes, with steady hands. Speak your name clearly. And remember that real power often looks like a child who simply will not step aside from what is right. If Sophia's courage touched something deep inside you today, drop a comment below and tell me. What's one moment in your life when you chose to stand your ground, even when it was scary? I read every single one. And if you want more stories that remind us who we really are, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now. Let's keep growing together, one honest, brave story at a time. Thank you for being here.